All right, and now we can talk about the experiments. Hopefully that was the last time I need to be interrupted. Okay, so in this setup, you have an individual patient who's had a severed corpus callosum sitting in front of a screen. They can't see through the screen, right? The screen will be opaque, but there will be a fixation point on the screen that they'll need to be looking at, and then a word of a familiar object will be flashed into one or the other monocular field of view, and the patient is asked to feel around for and identify the object that has been flashed to the monocular field of view. Okay, so this is what the individual might see, except if I could make this slide better, I would white this out, because it's key to this experiment to understand that the individual can't see the objects. They're asked to manually manipulate and identify them through touch. So the optic chiasm is intact. Visual information is directed to one hemisphere because it's projected to the monocular field of view. And it'll be a picture of a familiar object, something like a key or a fork or one of the other items that are shown here. Flashed specifically to the monocular field of view, and then an opening beneath the screen allows the individual to reach around, manipulate the items that are hidden from their view, including ones that are shown in the pictures. So an individual with an intact corpus callosum would be able to correctly locate the correct item, let's say a key, with either hand, either their left hand or the right hand. But let's see what happens when we have an individual with a transected corpus callosum. So if we were in lecture, I'd ask you to remind me, if we flash an image to the left monocular field of view or the left monocular visual field, where will that end up? Which side of the brain, right? And hopefully you remember your visual pathways, and you'll recall that the optic chiasm is intact here. And so that would cross at the optic chiasm and end up in the right hemisphere. Okay? And then, as we discussed when we started the second part of this lecture, there is ipsilateral communication between the visual cortex and the motor areas. And then you'll recall that the motor cortex controls contralaterally. So this patient will be able to pick up the correct object only with the left hand when the image is flashed to the left monocular field of view. Okay? Because in the monocular field of view, it'll end up in the right hemisphere. And from the right hemisphere, we would have communication to the right motor cortex, which would be required to operate the left hand when it is looking for and identifying the object. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Listen again if not. Now let's think about what happens if an image were to be flashed in the right monocular field of view. Okay, that will end up similarly in the contralateral side of the brain, so that'll end up in the left side of the brain. And once again, there's ipsilateral communication between the visual cortex and the motor areas. The motor cortex, again, controls contralaterally. So when an image is flashed to the right monocular visual field, the patient will only be able to pick up the correct object with their right hand, but not their left hand. Okay? If you need to draw out, diagram the circuitry, that might be helpful here to understand where there are ipsilateral and contralateral connections. But ipsilateral connections between the visual cortex and the motor areas. Remember your visual pathways crossing at the optic chiasm in the monocular field of view, and then contralateral control by the motor cortex. Okay, so 3 key things you need to think about in this scenario. And then a similar experiment, rather than flashing an image to end up in the visual cortex of one field or another, one hemisphere or another, was to ask the patient verbally to identify the object that was seen in the picture. So you flash the word key, and then you ask them to verbalize a response. What was the word that was just shown? So now you need to think about where Wernicke's and Broca's are. And you need to recall that the left hemisphere is language dominant. So patients would be able to make a correct verbal response, key, if the picture was projected to the right monocular field, because the right monocular field projects to the left visual cortex, and there would be ipsilateral communication between the left visual cortex and Broca's. However, if that image was flashed to the left monocular field of view and ended up in the right hemisphere, the corpus callosum is severed, so there would be no communication between the right visual field and the left language dominant hemisphere, i.e. Broca's. Okay, so a similar but slightly more complex type of experiment, because now you need to additionally consider Broca's, or tie this back into what we've been discussing about Broca's. All right, so most of this slide is review. We talked about the role of the frontal lobe and the prefrontal lobe in particular in motor planning, goal-directed behavior, personality. We talked about dysexecutive syndrome, and by now hopefully you've watched the video I posted for you, which had a little more information about how frontal lobotomies were the norm in the early and even up until the mid-1900s, which were used to apparently tame personalities or cure mental illness, part of our cruel history with mental illness. So I won't, these are summary points and discussed in previous lectures. And we've talked about patient HM and elaborated on learning and memory, and how damage, depending on where it is, can affect learned long or short-term memory, which we've again discussed at length in previous lectures. So the summary of new information is up here. What happens when there's damage to the posterior parietal lobe? And that's lateralized, meaning the symptoms will differ depending on whether it's damage to the left or right posterior parietal lobe. So dominant, which is often left, results in Gerstmann syndrome, and we'll see some of the symptoms associated with Gerstmann syndrome. It's relatively rare on the next slide. And then in the non-dominant, or typically right posterior parietal lobe, there's issues with visuospatial abilities. This is you determining where you are in space, and I'll give you an example on the next slide. So non-dominant, or usually right parietal lobe injury might look like this. So this is a cathedral in Florence. Something tells me there's probably not quite as many people milling around this particular cathedral in Florence at present. But in any case, let's imagine that we were at this cathedral, and I gave you a map. I gave you this map shown over here on the right. And then on the map, you have all these numbered points or lettered points. And if I were to ask you to use this map to tell me what vantage point this picture was taken from, right? So take a quick look at the map and tell me where the person was standing to take this image. And so it probably doesn't take you long to zoom in on A, right? Just looking at this map, you can see that here's the cathedral, and A is the place where the photograph would have been taken from. And so an individual who has a right or non-dominant parietal lobe injury will not have the ability to do this, or at least won't have the ability to do it well. So that's what's meant by visuospatial difficulties or issues. All right, so let's continue on with non-dominant or right damage. So spatial problems, and even neglecting parts of one's body. So we talked about the visuospatial issues, and often there's contralateral neglect. So if the damage is on the right side, then an individual will often ignore things that are on the left. So that might be even neglecting the left side of their own body. Or if you were to give a patient this model diagram over here on the right and ask them to reproduce it, this is what might be reproduced, right? So contralateral neglect, they're drawing everything on the right, but they're neglecting parts of the image that are on the left. Okay, and that's due specifically to the non-dominant parietal lobe or right parietal lobe injury. And then another feature or symptom is denying any kind of deficiency. So an individual will not see that their image is different than the image that they were presented with, and they won't understand or appreciate that they are in fact neglecting the left side of their body. And that's called anosognosia, is the term for denial of deficiency. And that can be the case with a number of different conditions, but it also arises specifically with non-dominant parietal lobe injury. And then Gerstmann syndrome, these are some symptoms: confusing left and right, an inability to write, inability to calculate, inability to recall words. So you can see that the symptomology is quite different depending on whether it's a dominant posterior parietal lobe injury or a non-dominant injury. If there's damage to both, bilateral damage results in kind of a more complex syndrome called balance, an inability to control gaze, inability to integrate components within a visual scene, and an inability to reach out for an object. So certainly more complex symptomology when there's bilateral damage. And here's an example of an artist. So he was most active in the early 1900s. He was a German artist named Anton Reiderscheit. And you can see in panel A and C some of his work prior to having a stroke that damaged his posterior parietal lobe sometime after middle age. And he continued to paint, but you can see that his works show signs of neglect, spatial neglect. So after he had a right cerebral stroke, in other words, non-dominant parietal lobe injury, you can see that his portraitures were much different, neglecting one side, and same thing with his still lifes, neglecting to a great extent one side of the image. So that's just one kind of real life example of what you might see with non-dominant posterior parietal lobe injury. This is the point in the course where I would normally hand out TA evaluations for you to do in lecture. We won't be doing that this term, but Renato has worked very hard this term, and I know he's there for you pretty much any time you need him, and he's working on the downtown east side right now with a very vulnerable group of individuals as we go through this. So if you've appreciated Renato this term, then it's a great time to maybe reach out and tell him. I'll leave you with some summary questions to do on your own, and we'll pick things up on Monday. 2 lectures to go, Monday and Wednesday, and I'll try and get them up as soon as I can for you, maybe Monday and Tuesday instead of Monday and Wednesday, so that you've got as much time as you possibly can to study the material. All right, stay in and stay safe, and I'll talk to you on Monday, if not sooner.